The notification appeared on my phone at 2:37 a.m. Unusual account activity detected. Half asleep, I opened our banking app to discover our joint savings, $412,000 we'd spent 8 years building, had been drained to just $186. 42. My husband, of 12 years, had emptied our accounts for his mistress, forgetting one crucial detail in his calculated betrayal. I was the sole trustee of his family's $2 million inheritance fund, appointed by his dying father, who had whispered to me, "He needs someone with sense to protect him from himself." How devastatingly prophetic those words would prove to be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'll never forget how the blue light of my phone screen illuminated the empty space beside me in our bed. The notification had jolted me from a dreamless sleep. Unusual account activity detected. At first, I thought it was a mistake, perhaps even a phishing attempt. James and I had been careful with our finances, building our savings methodically over 8 years of marriage. Just the previous evening, we'd discussed renovating the kitchen in our Connecticut home, laughing over paint samples and countertop materials. With sleep-heavy fingers, I navigated to our banking app, expecting to dismiss an erroneous alert. Instead, I found myself staring at a balance that couldn't possibly be correct. Our joint savings account, which should have shown $412,000, now displayed a mere $186. 42. A single transfer had been executed at 11:48 p.m. to an account number I didn't recognize. "James?" I called out, my voice sounding foreign in the darkness. Only silence answered. I switched on the bedside lamp and confirmed what I already knew. His side of the bed hadn't been slept in. His phone went straight to voicemail. 3 times. Moving through our house like a detective at a crime scene, I began noticing details that had escaped me before. The suitcase missing from the closet, the empty drawer in his dresser, the conspicuous absence of his passport from our home safe. These weren't the signs of a spontaneous late-night errand. They were the calculated actions of someone who had planned their departure. In our home office, I found his laptop gone and the desk drawer ajar. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery, the kind James's mother always insisted upon for proper correspondence. His handwriting, usually so precise, seemed hurried. "Vanessa, I can't continue living this lie. Catherine. And I have decided to start over somewhere we can be truly happy. The money is for our new life together. I'll have my lawyer contact you about divorce proceedings. I'm sorry things ended this way. James Catherine, his 26-year-old executive assistant. The woman I'd welcomed into our home for dinner just 3 months ago, who had complimented my roast chicken with practiced sincerity while apparently plotting to dismantle my marriage. The shock gave way to a wave of nausea so powerful, I barely made it to the bathroom. As I knelt on the cold tile floor, pieces began falling into place. James's recent conference trips that required no video calls, the sudden password changes, on his personal devices, the unexplained expenses that he'd attributed to client entertainment. I'd trusted him completely. We'd built a life together from the ground up, or so I thought. James had come from family money, yes, but his father had made him work for every opportunity, convinced that earned success was the only kind worth having. I'd fallen in love with his ambition, his vision for building something meaningful rather than simply living off his expected inheritance. When James's father was diagnosed with terminal cancer 3 years into our marriage, he'd made a decision that had seemed odd to me at the time. He'd named me, not James, as the sole trustee of the Reynolds family trust. He needs someone with sense to protect him from himself, the elder Reynolds had told me privately from his hospital bed, his voice weakened by illness, but his mind still razor-sharp. "Promise me you'll be that person, Vanessa." I'd promised, never truly understanding what that responsibility might someday entail. The trust had specific conditions, Distributions were allowed for business investments, education, primary residence purchases, and medical emergencies. All other dispersals would require trustee approval until James reached the age of 50. He was 38 now. The realization hit me with stunning clarity as I sat on the bathroom floor, still in my silk pajamas, at 3 in the morning. James had emptied our joint accounts, but he couldn't touch the trust without my approval. The $2 million inheritance fund remained intact, protected from his impulsive betrayal by his father's foresight. My phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet house. Unknown number. Hello. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Vanessa? It's Diana Reynolds. My mother-in-law's cultured voice carried the perpetual note of disapproval I'd grown accustomed to over a decade of family gatherings. James just called. He said, "You might be upset." Upset, I repeated, a hysterical laugh threatening to escape. He emptied our accounts and left a note saying he's running away with his assistant. Upset doesn't begin to cover it. A heavy sigh. I was afraid something like this might happen eventually. The Reynolds men have always had difficulty with constancy. It's why I warned you against joint accounts when you married. The casual way she referenced her son's betrayal, as if infidelity and financial abandonment were merely unfortunate family traits, like receding hairlines or poor eyesight, ignited something beyond shock and hurt. White-hot anger blazed through my veins. "Did you know?" I demanded. "Did you know he was planning this?" "Of course not," Diana replied, though something in her tone suggested incomplete honesty. "But I did meet Catherine at the club last month. She seemed motivated, very interested in the family history, asked quite a lot about the trust." The image formed instantly in my mind. Diana and Catherine sipping overpriced champagne at the country club, discussing the Reynolds family wealth as if it were Catherine's birthright to access it. As if my role as trustee was merely a technicality to be navigated around. "James says he's tried calling you," Diana continued. "He wants to discuss arrangements amicably." Amicably? The word tasted bitter. "He stole our savings and abandoned our marriage in the middle of the night. There's nothing amicable about that." "Vanessa, dear, this emotional approach won't serve anyone. James has made his decision, unfortunate as the timing may be. The priority now is to handle matters with appropriate discretion." Appropriate discretion. The Reynolds family motto might as well have been, "Appearances above all." It had been Diana's primary concern throughout our marriage, ensuring James maintained the correct social connections, that I understood the unwritten rules of their privileged world, that nothing ever disturbed the carefully cultivated image of old money respectability. "Put James on the phone," I said, straightening my spine despite being alone in my bathroom. "He's not actually here," Diana admitted. "He just called to let me know there might be complications. He and Catherine are apparently traveling. He didn't specify where." "Traveling with over $400,000 of our joint savings," I clarified. "Money we both earned. Money we saved together for our future." "Well, these things can be sorted out through the proper channels. I've already spoken to Martin," she said, referencing the family attorney who had drafted the trust documents. "He'll be reaching out to discuss the separation process." "I'm sure he will," I replied, a strange calm settling over me. "And while you're speaking with Martin, you might remind him that as trustee of James's inheritance fund, I'll need to be kept fully informed of any inquiries or attempted withdrawals." The silence that followed lasted several seconds longer than a normal conversational pause. When Diana spoke again, her tone had shifted subtly. "Vanessa, I understand you're hurt right now, but the trust is a family matter." "The trust," I interrupted, "is a legal arrangement that gives me fiduciary responsibility for those assets until James turns 50. Your husband made me trustee because he trusted my judgment over James's. That hasn't changed because James decided to abandon our marriage. Another weighted silence. This situation is already unfortunate enough without introducing additional complications. Translation. Don't use your position as trustee to punish James for his infidelity. I have no intention of introducing complications, Diana. I intend to fulfill my responsibility exactly as your husband asked me to, protecting those assets from impulsive, self-destructive decisions. I paused, then added, like emptying shared accounts to run away with a younger woman. I see. Her tone had cooled considerably. Well, I suppose we'll have our respective attorneys sort things out. I suppose we will. Good night, Diana. After ending the call, I sat motionless on the edge of the bathtub, staring at my reflection in the mirror across the room. The woman, looking back at me, appeared surprisingly composed despite the circumstances. Her dark hair tousled from sleep, her complexion pale with shock, but her green eyes clear and focused. I had promised my father-in-law that I would protect James from himself. I had failed to see the warning signs of his betrayal, had trusted him completely despite Diana's veiled suggestions about Reynolds men and their tendencies. But now, faced with the wreckage of that trust, I found myself contemplating a different interpretation of my trustee responsibility. Protection didn't always mean simply preserving assets. Sometimes it meant ensuring they were used exactly as intended, for growth, for security, for building something meaningful rather than funding an impulsive escape from responsibility. As dawn's first light began filtering through the bathroom window, I reached for my phone and called the one person I knew would understand both the legal and emotional complexity of my situation. Meredith Chen Legal, answered a crisp voice, despite the early hour. Meredith, it's Vanessa Reynolds. I need your help. My husband has emptied our accounts and left me for his assistant. And there's a $2 million trust fund involvement I need to discuss. I'll be at your house in 45 minutes, Meredith replied without hesitation. Don't contact him or anyone else until I get there. As I ended the call, a strange sense of clarity began emerging from the chaos of betrayal. James had taken our savings, believing it would fund his new beginning with Catherine. But in his rush to escape, he had forgotten the most significant financial reality of his life. He had never controlled his trust. I did. And now, that responsibility had taken on an entirely new dimension. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meredith arrived exactly when she promised, briefcase in one hand and a carrier with 2 large coffees in the other. I'd known her since law school, before she built one of Boston's most formidable boutique family law practices. We'd remained close despite the gradual social pruning that had occurred throughout my marriage. The subtle way James had engineered distance between me and friends who didn't fit into the Reynolds circle of influence. You look surprisingly composed for someone whose husband just committed financial infidelity of this magnitude, she observed, handing me a coffee as we settled in my home office. I'm still in shock, I admitted. It doesn't feel entirely real. Yet. Meredith nodded, her expression softening briefly before shifting into professional focus. Then let's deal with what is real. Facts, documents, legal positions. The emotions will catch up soon enough, and we need to be prepared when they do. For the next 2 hours, we methodically assembled a comprehensive picture of my financial and legal situation. I provided bank statements documenting my contributions to our joint accounts, the trust documents naming me as trustee, property deeds, investment portfolios, and the handwritten note James had left behind. This is actually helpful, Meredith said, holding up the note. He's explicitly acknowledged taking the money and his intention to use it for himself and Catherine. That undermines any claim that this was a mutually agreed-upon decision or that the funds were taken for legitimate marital purposes. As Meredith continued her assessment, my phone repeatedly lit up with calls from unknown numbers. James had apparently begun using different phones to try to reach me after I'd blocked his primary number. Don't answer any calls unless you recognize the number as someone in your support network, Meredith advised. Any communication with James or his representatives should happen through me now. My email chimed with a new message from Martin Schaefer, the Reynolds family attorney. Should I open it? I asked. Meredith nodded. Let's see what their opening position is. The message was brief and coldly professional. Dear Vanessa, in light of recent developments, I have been retained to represent James Reynolds in the dissolution of your marriage. While these situations are always regrettable, my client wishes to approach the separation with minimal conflict and disruption. As you are aware, certain financial adjustments have already been implemented. My client proposes the following settlement terms to expedite resolution. 1. A complete mutual release of claims against marital assets currently in either party's possession. Your resignation as trustee of the Reynolds Family Trust to be replaced by Diana Reynolds 3. Continuation of your residence in the Connecticut home for a period not to exceed 6 months, allowing sufficient time for transition. In exchange, my client will not contest your retention of your personal business assets and intellectual property. I believe these terms represent a fair and equitable resolution given the circumstances. Please have your representative contact me to formalize this arrangement. Sincerely, Martin Schaefer. Esquire. Meredith let out a short, incredulous laugh. Well, they certainly didn't waste any time. This is remarkably brazen, even by high net worth divorce standards. They want me to just accept that he took our savings and give up the trustee position? The audacity was almost impressive. They're hoping you're too emotionally devastated to think clearly, Meredith explained, her expression hardening. This is a classic first move. Propose something outrageously one-sided while the wounded spouse is still reeling, hoping for quick capitulation. She pulled her laptop from her briefcase. Let's draft our response, and it's going to be very different from what they're expecting. While Meredith began composing a formal legal response, I excused myself to shower and change. The simple act of washing away the night's shock and tears felt surprisingly restorative. As warm water cascaded over me, my mind began working with unexpected clarity, cataloging assets, recalling account details, considering strategic options. By the time I returned to the office in fresh clothes, hair still damp but neatly combed, I had reached several important decisions. I'm not giving up the trustee position, I announced as I rejoined Meredith. Not just because it gives me leverage in the divorce, but because James's father entrusted me with that responsibility for a reason. What James has done, emptying our accounts to run away with Catherine, proves his father's concerns were valid. Meredith looked up from her laptop, her expression thoughtful. I agree that maintaining the trustee position is crucial, but I want you to be prepared for how ugly this could get. Diana Reynolds will view this as a direct challenge to family authority. They'll paint you as vindictive, as using the trust to punish James for the affair. Let them, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I've spent 12 years of my life trying to earn Diana's approval, trying to fit into the Reynolds ideal of what a suitable wife should be. I'm done with that performance. A small smile crossed Meredith's face. Good. Now let's talk about immediate practical concerns. Your joint accounts have been drained, which affects your access to liquid cash. We need to establish financial stability while we pursue recovery of your share of those assets. We spent the next hour creating a triage plan. I had my own professional income as an architectural historian and preservation consultant, with several ongoing projects that would generate revenue in the coming weeks. I also had a separate investment account that James couldn't access. Modest, by Reynolds standards, but sufficient to cover immediate expenses while legal proceedings began. What about the Connecticut house? I asked. The mortgage is substantial. The property is jointly owned, Meredith confirmed, reviewing the deed. And while James might have taken the liquid assets, he's still legally responsible for his share of joint debts, including the mortgage. We'll include that in our response to Martin. As we finalized our immediate strategy, my phone rang with a call from a number I recognized, James's sister, Charlotte. Unlike Diana, Charlotte had always treated me with genuine warmth, maintaining a relationship independent of family politics. I should take this, I told Meredith, who nodded understanding. Vanessa? Charlotte's voice was tight with concern. Are you all right? I just heard what's happened. I'm managing, I replied carefully. It's been a shocking 24 hours. I can't believe he did this, she said, genuine anger evident in her tone. Running off with his assistant is bad enough, but stealing your joint savings, that's beyond unforgivable. Her immediate validation, calling it stealing rather than financial adjustments, as Martin had so delicately phrased it, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Thank you for calling, Charlotte. It means a lot. Of course, she said. Look, I know Mother is already closing ranks around James. It's what she does. But I want you to know that not everyone in this family thinks that loyalty means excusing inexcusable behavior. Charlotte's support created a small crack in the armor I'd been building since reading James's note. I don't want to put you in a difficult position with your family. James put himself in a difficult position, she corrected firmly. And Mother can be as angry with me as she wants. I'm not choosing between you and James. I'm choosing basic human decency. After promising to check in regularly and offering any support I might need, Charlotte ended the call. The conversation left me feeling stronger. The knowledge that not everyone in James's family viewed me as the enemy providing unexpected comfort. That sounded positive, Meredith observed as I set down my phone. It was. Charlotte's always been different from the rest of them. I returned to my seat at the desk. What's our next step? I've drafted our initial response to Martin, she said, turning her laptop so I could review the document. It establishes our position clearly. You categorically reject their proposed terms. You will be seeking immediate recovery of your portion. Of the misappropriated funds, you will continue in your capacity as trustee as legally designated, and any further communication should come directly to me. The language was precise, professional, and unmistakably firm. No emotional appeals, no attempts to shame James for his behavior. Just a clear articulation of legal position and intent. It's perfect, I said after reviewing the document. I've also drafted emergency motions to freeze any remaining joint assets and to request interim financial support given the circumstances, Meredith continued. We'll file them this afternoon. As she prepared to send the response, my phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. Vanessa, it's James. Please stop ignoring my calls. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Just accept Martin's offer and we can all move forward. Catherine and I deserve a fresh start, and fighting this will only drag out the inevitable. The breathtaking entitlement of it, the assumption that I should simply step aside to facilitate his fresh start with the woman he'd betrayed me for, crystallized something important within me. This wasn't just about the money he'd taken, or even the betrayal itself. This was about a fundamental imbalance that had characterized our entire relationship. His belief that his desires, his choices, his convenience should always take precedence over mine. I showed Meredith the message and her expression hardened. This is actually helpful, she said. It demonstrates his mindset and supports our position. May I screenshot this for our files? After sending Meredith's response to Martin, we moved to the kitchen where I mechanically prepared lunch. Simple sandwiches that neither of us had much appetite for. The initial shock was beginning to wear off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the first waves of grief for the life I had. believed in until just hours ago. It's going to hit you in waves, Meredith said gently, recognizing the shift in my demeanor. Shock, anger, grief, determination, they don't come in neat, sequential stages. They crash into each other, sometimes all at once. How do I get through that while fighting this legal battle? 1 hour at a time, she advised. And by remembering that your emotional response to betrayal doesn't diminish your intellectual capacity to address it. As we finished our meal, my email chimed with a response from Martin. The tone had shifted dramatically from his initial communication. Counselor Chen, I am in receipt of your response on behalf of Mrs. Reynolds. While I appreciate the challenging, emotional circumstances, I must emphasize that your client's continued role as trustee of the Reynolds Family Trust represents an untenable conflict of interest, given the dissolution of the marriage. My client is prepared to increase his settlement offer to include additional financial considerations if Mrs. Reynolds will voluntarily step down as trustee. This is offered in good faith to avoid protracted litigation that would benefit neither party. Regarding the funds transferred from joint accounts, my client maintains that these represented his equal share of marital assets, which he was legally entitled to access. However, in the interest of amicable resolution, he may consider a partial reallocation once trustee matters are resolved satisfactorily. I look forward to your prompt response. Martin Schaefer, Escauer. They're already modifying their position, Meredith observed with satisfaction. They realized their initial approach was too aggressive. Now they're trying to negotiate, using the joint account funds as leverage to get you to relinquish the trustee position. Which means they're worried about the trustee issue, I concluded. Exactly. It's our strongest point of leverage and they know it. Meredith closed her laptop decisively. We don't respond to this immediately. Let them wonder and worry about your next move. As Meredith prepared to leave, armed with documents to file and a clear strategy for moving forward, she paused at the door. Vanessa, I want you to remember something important. What James did, both the affair and the financial betrayal, reflects his character, not your worth. In the coming weeks, Diana and their attorneys will try to make you doubt yourself, to make you feel you're being unreasonable for fighting back. Don't let them. With Meredith gone, the house fell into profound silence. Standing in the entryway, I was suddenly acutely aware of how many design choices reflected James's preferences rather than mine. The austere modernist aesthetic that had always felt slightly cold to me, the deliberate absence of personal photographs in favor of abstract art selected by Diana's preferred gallery. I moved through each room with new eyes, seeing not just the physical space, but the psychological concessions embedded within it. How many times had I deferred to James's taste, his social preferences, his vision of how our life should look? How often had I edited myself, my opinions, my desires, my individuality, to maintain harmony? In my bedroom, I opened James's closet to find it half empty, the remaining items precisely the ones he valued least. Even in betrayal, he'd been calculated, taking exactly what he wanted and leaving behind what no longer served him. I sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing myself to fully feel the magnitude of what had happened. The tears came then, hot and furious, not just for the betrayal of the previous night, but for years of small compromises and overlooked warning signs, for the gradual surrender of self I'd accepted as the price of belonging in the Reynolds world. When the storm of emotion finally subsided, I moved to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. The woman in the mirror looked different somehow, eyes puffy from crying, but clearer, more focused than they had appeared in the morning's shock. You never deserved him anyway, I whispered to my reflection, suddenly recalling Diana's frequent subtle implication that I had somehow won a prize above my station by marrying her son. For the first time, I considered that perhaps she had been right all along, but not in the way she had intended. I hadn't deserved a husband who could abandon our marriage without a conversation. I hadn't deserved to have my financial security stolen in the night. I hadn't deserved to be treated as disposable after 12 years of partnership. What I deserved was so much more than what James had offered. And now, with the trustee position as both responsibility and unexpected power, I had the opportunity to ensure that justice, not revenge but true equity, would prevail. My phone chimed with an email notification, confirmation from the court that our emergency motions had been filed and a hearing date assigned. The strategy was in motion. Taking a deep breath, I straightened my shoulders and returned to the home office. There was work to be done, not just legal preparations, but the methodical reclamation of my life, my space, and my future. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time since reading James's note, I felt something beyond shock and grief, a steadily growing conviction that this ending could also be the beginning of something far more authentic than what I was losing. The emergency court hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, just 3 days after discovering James's betrayal. In those 72 hours, my world continued to shift on its axis in unexpected ways. Martin Schaefer had sent 2 more increasingly urgent emails, each softening the Reynolds family position slightly while maintaining pressure for me to relinquish the trustee role. By Wednesday afternoon, Diana herself called, her carefully modulated voice betraying only the slightest tension. "Vanessa, I understand you're upset, but this adversarial approach isn't helping anyone," she began without preamble. "James made a mistake." "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner, Diana," I interrupted, surprising myself with my directness. Emptying our joint accounts and abandoning our marriage for his assistant was a deliberate choice. She sighed with practiced patience. "These things happen in marriages, particularly in certain circles. Discretion and dignity in handling them is what separates the upper class from the rest of us mere mortals," I finished for her. "I'm familiar with your philosophy on these matters. Then you understand why dragging this into the courts is unnecessary, and frankly, beneath the standards of this family." "What's beneath the standards of any decent family is stealing from your spouse," I replied evenly. "I'm not the one who created this situation, Diana." "Regarding the trustee matter," she continued, ignoring my comment, "I've spoken with the other board members. We all agree that given the circumstances, it would be appropriate for you to step aside. I'm prepared to assume the responsibility myself to ensure a smooth transition." I had expected this, of course. The board members she referenced were her brother and oldest friend, figures who had always deferred to Diana's wishes in family matters. "I appreciate your concern," I said, channeling her own formal politeness. "But Harrison appointed me trustee with specific instructions about my responsibilities. Nothing in those instructions suggests I should abandon that role because James chose to abandon our marriage." Her tone cooled perceptibly. "You should consider your position carefully, Vanessa. James is willing to be generous in the settlement. If you cooperate on the trust issue, fighting this will only deplete resources that could otherwise benefit you both." "I'll take that under advisement," I replied neutrally. "Is there anything else?" After a frigid goodbye, I ended the call and immediately phoned Meredith to update her on this latest development. "They're getting nervous," she observed. "Diana wouldn't have called personally if they weren't concerned about tomorrow's hearing. She implied the entire board wants me removed as trustee." Meredith laughed shortly. "Of course she did. But the trust documents are clear. You can only be removed as trustee under specific circumstances, none of which include James decided to have an affair and empty your joint accounts." That evening, I forced myself to eat a proper meal and review the documents Meredith had prepared for the hearing. We were seeking 3 immediate remedies: freezing all remaining joint assets, ordering the return of my portion of the misappropriated funds, and official recognition of my continued authority as trustee despite the marital separation. As I closed the file, my phone displayed a notification. An email from an unfamiliar address. K. Lawrence Edgemail. Com. The subject line read only, "You should know the truth." My pulse quickened as I opened it. "Vanessa, you don't know me, but I think you should have information that James and his mother are hiding from you. My name is Karen Lawrence. Until 3 months ago, I worked as Diana's personal assistant. I was terminated after discovering certain financial irregularities involving James and Reynolds Holdings. I signed an NDA as part of my separation agreement, but given recent events, I believe you deserve to know what's happening. James has been systematically misrepresenting the financial health of several Reynolds investment properties to both the board and trust administrators. The Westlake Development Project in particular has been hemorrhaging money for over a year due to significant construction defects that were concealed from investors. More concerning is that he has been trying to access trust funds without proper authorization, claiming the investments were yielding returns when they were actually failing. Diana has been helping cover these discrepancies in internal reporting. I have documentation of these activities. If you're interested in learning more, I can be reached at this email or 617-555-4892. I'm sorry to bring more difficult news during what must already be a challenging time. Karen Lawrence. I read the email twice, my mind racing. If what Karen alleged was true, it could explain James's desperate need for liquid capital, and why maintaining control of the trust was so crucial to both him and Diana. I immediately called Meredith despite the late hour. "This could completely change our approach," she said, after I forwarded her the email. "If James has been attempting to misappropriate trust funds or misrepresenting investments to the board, that's not just a divorce issue. It's potentially criminal." Should I meet with her? Absolutely, but not alone, and not without verifying her identity first. I'll have my investigator run a background check tonight. If she checks out, let's meet her tomorrow after the hearing. Sleep proved elusive that night. I paced through the house that had once represented security and partnership, but now felt like a museum of elaborate deceptions. How much of what I'd believed about our marriage, about the Reynolds family enterprise itself, had been carefully constructed fiction? Morning arrived with a text from Meredith confirming that Karen Lawrence had indeed worked as Diana's assistant for 4 years before her abrupt departure 3 months ago. We arranged to meet her at Meredith's office following the court hearing. The courthouse presented its own challenges. As I walked up the granite steps with Meredith beside me, I spotted Martin Schaefer waiting in the lobby, his expression grave. What surprised me was who stood beside him, not Diana as I had expected, but James himself, looking uncharacteristically disheveled in a suit that appeared slept in. "He's back from his romantic getaway already?" I murmured to Meredith. "Interesting timing," she replied quietly. "Stay focused and don't engage directly unless absolutely necessary." When James spotted me, he immediately moved in our direction, waving off Martin's cautioning hand. "Vanessa," he said, his voice holding an unfamiliar note of desperation. "We need to talk before this goes any further." Meredith stepped slightly forward. "Mr. Reynolds, my client has no interest in private conversation. Any communication should go through counsel." "This is between my wife and me," he insisted, his attention fixed on me. "Vanessa, this situation has gotten out of hand. There are things you don't understand." "Like why you emptied our accounts in the middle of the night?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the surge of anger his presence triggered. "Or why you're suddenly back without Catherine?" A flash of something, embarrassment, fear, crossed his face. "It's complicated. If you'll just agree to Martin's proposal about the trust, I can make everything right. I'll return the money. We can—" "Your proposal is unacceptable to my client," Meredith interrupted firmly. "If you have a revised settlement offer, submit it properly through counsel." A court officer approached, announcing that our hearing would begin shortly. As we moved toward the courtroom, James called after me. "This isn't just about us anymore, Vanessa. There are bigger considerations at stake." The hearing itself proceeded with unexpected swiftness. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, reviewed our emergency motions and James's hastily filed response, then rendered her decision with decisive clarity. The court grants the motion to freeze all joint assets pending further proceedings. Regarding the funds removed from joint accounts, Mr. Reynolds is ordered to return 50% of all transferred amounts within 48 hours. And on the matter of Mrs. Reynolds's trustee position, the court finds no legal basis for removal. The trust documents clearly outline the specific conditions under which a trustee may be removed, none of which apply in this situation. She fixed James with a stern look. "Mr. Reynolds, the court takes a very dim view of unilateral financial actions taken on the eve of separation. Future conduct of this nature could result in additional sanctions." As we exited the courtroom, the shift in power dynamics was palpable. Martin immediately approached Meredith, requesting a private conference room for settlement discussions. James stood apart, speaking tensely into his phone, presumably updating Diana on this unfavorable outcome. "We've strengthened our position significantly," Meredith noted as we walked briskly toward the exit. "Now, let's find out what Karen Lawrence knows." Karen was waiting at Meredith's office when we arrived, a slim portfolio folder in her hands. She appeared to be in her early 40s, professionally dressed with the alert, observant demeanor I associated with highly efficient executive assistants. After introductions and signing a confidentiality agreement that Meredith had prepared, Karen opened the folder and began laying out documents on the conference table. "These are internal financial reports for Reynolds Holdings' major development projects over the past 18 months, she explained, pointing to a series of spreadsheets. "And these are the actual performance metrics I discovered while preparing materials for an audit." The discrepancies were immediately apparent. Projected profits where significant losses existed, completed construction phases that remained, unfinished vendor payments recorded as disbursed when they remained outstanding. "The Westlake project is the most concerning," Karen continued. "They've sunk over $12 million into it, but the environmental remediation costs were grossly underestimated, and 3 major investors have quietly pulled out. Why would James hide these issues rather than address them?" I asked, trying to reconcile this information with the meticulous businessman I thought I had married. Karen hesitated. "Based on communications I processed, I believe he was hoping to access trust funds to cover the shortfalls without alerting the board to the true state of these investments. Diana was helping him prepare the formal request to you as trustee, with documentation that would have significantly misrepresented the purpose and risk level, which explains their desperation to remove me as trustee now," I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "They need someone who won't question these discrepancies or who's already complicit in covering them up." "Exactly," Karen confirmed. "When I discovered these irregularities and brought them to Diana's attention, thinking it was an accounting error, she immediately had me sign an enhanced NDA and terminated my position the following week." Meredith, who had been examining the documents carefully, looked up. "This goes beyond divorce proceedings. This is potential securities fraud, misappropriation of corporate funds, and attempted trust fraud." "Why come forward now?" I asked Karen directly. "The NDA you signed presumably covered these matters." She met my gaze steadily. "I worked closely with Harrison Reynolds for 6 years before his illness. He was a man of absolute integrity, who built that company on principle as much as business acumen. What James and Diana are doing dishonors everything he stood for." She paused. "And frankly, when I heard about how James left you, stealing your shared savings and running off with his assistant, it was the final straw. Some things matter more than legal agreements." After Karen departed, Meredith and I sat in stunned silence, absorbing the implications of what we'd learned. "This changes everything," she finally said. Your position as trustee isn't just about the divorce settlement anymore. It's about protecting the trust assets from potential fraud. Harrison Reynolds appointed you for exactly this scenario. The weight of that responsibility settled on me with new clarity. Harrison's final request, that I protect James from himself, now carried deeper significance than I'd ever imagined. "What's our next move?" I asked. "We need to bring in forensic accounting expertise immediately," Meredith replied, already reaching for her phone. "And we should consider whether these findings need to be shared with the other trust board members, independent of Diana's influence." As Meredith made arrangements, I found myself staring at the documents spread across the table, physical evidence of deception far more extensive than James's affair, or even the emptied accounts. This wasn't just personal betrayal, it was systematic dishonesty that threatened the foundation of the business Harrison had built over a lifetime. My phone vibrated with an incoming call. James again. This time I decided to answer. "What do you want, James? We need to talk," he said, his voice tight with contained panic. "Not through lawyers. Just you and me." "I think we're beyond that point." "You don't understand what's at stake," he insisted. "This isn't just about us or even the money I took. There are business considerations that affect many people. If you'll just agree to transfer the trustee position to Mother temporarily, so she can approve funding for failing projects based on fraudulent reports?" I interrupted, taking satisfaction in his sharp intake of breath. "What are you talking about?" "Karen Lawrence reached out to me. I know about Westlake and the other properties. I know you've been misrepresenting their financial status to the board. I know you are planning to request trust funds based on false information." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of his uneven breathing. "Vanessa," he finally said, his voice now unnervingly calm, "think very carefully about your next steps. You're making accusations with serious implications, based on the word of a disgruntled former employee. She has documentation, James, detailed documentation that we're having independently verified." Another stretching silence. Then, "What do you want?" The question was so nakedly transactional, so devoid of remorse or even acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused, that it crystallized something important for me. This man, this person I had loved and built a life with for 12 years, was fundamentally focused on negotiation rather than reconciliation, on damage control rather than accountability. "I want what Harrison wanted when he made me trustee," I replied evenly. "Integrity in the management of the trust assets and protection of his legacy, something you and Diana seem to have forgotten the value of." "Don't be naive," he snapped, frustration breaking through his controlled facade. "Business involves compromise. Father understood that better than anyone. Harrison believed in ethical compromise, not fraud," I corrected. "And he entrusted me with ensuring that distinction remained clear." After ending the call, I rejoined Meredith, who had secured a forensic accounting team to begin work immediately. "James just tried to negotiate directly," I informed her. "When that failed, he attempted to intimidate me." She nodded, unsurprised. "They're growing desperate, which means we need to move quickly. The hearing this morning was just the beginning. Now we need to fully understand the scope of what we're dealing with." As we outlined next steps, I felt a surprising sense of clarity emerging from the chaos of the past few days. The betrayal remained painful, the logistics of untangling our lives daunting, but something else was taking shape alongside those challenges, a growing understanding of why Harrison had chosen me for this role. He had seen something in me that I had gradually lost sight of during my years of marriage to his son, an unwavering commitment to integrity that no amount of social pressure or family expectation could erode. In appointing me trustee, Harrison hadn't just been protecting James from impulsive financial decisions. He had been protecting his life's work from the compromise of its founding principles. And now, faced with evidence of how necessary that Protection had become, I found myself standing more firmly in that responsibility than I had ever imagined possible. When I returned home that evening, the house that had felt so empty just days before seemed different somehow. Not just the space I had shared with a man who had betrayed me, but the place where I would begin rebuilding on a foundation of truth, rather than accommodation. Diana's dismissive assessment of me throughout our marriage, the subtle implication that I had married above my station, that I should be perpetually grateful for inclusion in their world, now seemed not just cruel, but deeply ironic. Far from being unworthy of the Reynolds name, I was perhaps the only person currently honoring what it had once represented. As I prepared for bed, my phone displayed a text from Charlotte. Heard about the hearing. Mother is livid. James is panicking. You're doing exactly what Father would have wanted. Stay strong. Call if you need anything. Her support reinforced my growing conviction that this painful upheaval, while not of my choosing, was perhaps necessary, not just for my personal growth, but for the restoration of something larger that had lost its way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, forensic accountants, legal strategies, difficult conversations with board members. But tonight, I understood with unexpected clarity that the power to protect what mattered had been mine all along. Not because of my marriage to James, but because Harrison had recognized in me the strength of character his son and wife had spent years trying to diminish. The woman who had awakened to a devastating betrayal just days ago was discovering that she was far more prepared to face this crisis than anyone, including herself, had realized. By the following morning, the forensic accounting team had confirmed Karen's allegations with disturbing clarity. The Westlake development project wasn't simply underperforming. It was effectively insolvent, with environmental remediation costs approaching triple the original estimates and construction defects requiring extensive rework. More troubling were the systematic attempts to conceal these issues from both investors and board members through creative accounting and selective reporting. Based on our preliminary findings, Reynolds Holdings has been operating with significant, undisclosed liabilities for at least 14 months, explained Deanna Morris, the lead forensic accountant, as we gathered in Meredith's office. The company appears to have maintained two sets of financial records: the official statements shared with the board and external partners, and internal tracking that reflects the actual financial position. Meredith's expression remained professionally neutral, but her voice carried the weight of legal implications when she asked, "In your professional opinion, does this constitute fraud?" Deanna nodded without hesitation. The discrepancies are too significant and too systematic to be attributable to error or differing accounting methodologies. This represents intentional misrepresentation of material financial information. The confirmation settled over me with surprising calm. Part of me had still hoped for an alternative explanation, some legitimizing factor that might preserve a shred of the integrity I had always associated with James, despite his personal betrayal. "What happens if this information becomes public?" I asked. "The consequences would be severe," Deanna explained. "Beyond potential legal actions from investors and regulatory bodies, the reputational damage would likely render the company unviable in its current form. The Reynolds name carries significant weight in development circles. Undermining that trust would have far-reaching implications." After the accountants departed, Meredith turned to me with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Vanessa, we need to discuss your options carefully. You're in a position of extraordinary leverage, but also significant responsibility. As trustee, you have fiduciary obligations that now directly conflict with what would typically be optimal divorce strategy. Meaning? Meaning that exposing these financial irregularities publicly would certainly strengthen your position against James by damaging his credibility and financial standing. However, it would also potentially devalue or destroy assets that, as trustee, you're obligated to protect." The complexity of my position crystallized in that moment. Personal, grievance against fiduciary duty, justified anger against ethical responsibility. The path of pure revenge would be straightforward. Use the evidence to ensure James faced maximum consequences for his betrayal. The path of pure protection would be equally clear. Work quietly to address the financial issues while maintaining the company's public reputation. Neither seemed quite right. What would serve justice while honoring my responsibilities as trustee? I asked finally. Meredith considered this carefully. I believe we need to approach this on multiple fronts. First, secure the trust assets from further misappropriation. Second, address the financial irregularities within Reynolds Holdings without necessarily triggering immediate public disclosure. Third, use this leverage to negotiate a divorce settlement that reflects both the financial and personal betrayal you've experienced. And how do we accomplish all that simultaneously? By forcing a direct confrontation with all relevant parties, she replied decisively. James, Diana, the board members, and the trust administrators, all in one room with all cards on the table. The strategy was bold, potentially risky, but ultimately necessary. After discussing logistics, Meredith began making arrangements while I returned home to prepare mentally for what would undoubtedly be an intense confrontation. As I walked through the front door, I was startled to find Diana Reynolds sitting in my living room, a china teacup balanced perfectly on her knee, as if this were a scheduled social call rather than an invasion of my privacy. I let myself in, she said, noting my surprise. I still have the spare key James gave me for emergencies. This hardly qualifies as an emergency, I replied, removing my coat and placing my keys on the entry table with deliberate calm. And I'll need that key back before you leave, she smiled thinly. Always so direct. It's refreshing in its way, though lacking the social graces one might hope for. The familiar criticism, subtle, delivered with a smile, might once have made me second-guess myself. Now it simply underscored how consistently she had worked to diminish me throughout my marriage to her son. What do you want, Diana? She set down her teacup with precision. I want to offer you a more generous settlement than what our legal teams might eventually negotiate. One that acknowledges your contributions to the marriage while allowing our family to move forward without unnecessary public difficulties. You mean without exposing the financial irregularities at Reynolds Holdings, I clarified. Her expression remained impressively composed, though a slight tightening around her eyes betrayed her surprise. I'm not sure what you're referring to. I'm simply trying to facilitate an amicable resolution to an unfortunate situation. Let's not waste each other's time, I said, taking a seat across from her. I know about Westlake and the other failing projects. I know about the misrepresentations to the board and investors. I know about the planned attempt to access trust funds under false pretenses. For the first time in our 12-year acquaintance, I watched genuine alarm break through Diana's carefully maintained facade. It lasted only a moment before her composure reasserted itself, but it confirmed everything. These are complex business matters that you may not fully understand, she began, her tone suggesting patient explanation to someone of limited capacity. Development projects often face challenges and require flexible accounting approaches during transitional phases. Flexible accounting is an interesting euphemism for fraud, I observed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Be careful with such accusations, Vanessa. They could have significant consequences for everyone involved, including you. Your standard of living, your social position, even your professional reputation are all connected to the Reynolds name. The threat was delivered with such casual elegance that it might have been mistaken for concern by someone who didn't know better. I did know better. Let me be very clear, Diana. I've spent 12 years trying to earn your approval, trying to fit into your world on your terms. That ended the moment your son emptied our accounts and left me a handwritten note explaining he was running off with his assistant. I leaned forward slightly. I'm not interested in threats or manipulations. I'm not interested in your assessment of my social graces or my understanding of business matters. What I am interested in is justice, both for myself personally and for Harrison's legacy, which your son has been systematically undermining. The mention of her late husband's name struck a visible chord. For a flickering moment, something almost like shame crossed her aristocratic features. Harrison was an idealist, she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Brilliant in many ways, but somewhat naive about the realities of maintaining a family enterprise across generations. Sometimes compromises are necessary. Compromises, yes. Fraud, no. Harrison understood the difference, which is precisely why he made me trustee rather than you or James. Diana set her jaw, then reached into her designer handbag and withdrew an envelope. $5 million, she said, placing it on the coffee table between us. In addition to a fair division of marital assets, in exchange, you step down as trustee and sign comprehensive confidentiality agreements regarding Reynolds Holdings. The directness of the bribe, for that's exactly what it was, momentarily stunned me. Not because I was tempted, but because it revealed just how desperate their position had become. Your offer is declined, I said, leaving the envelope untouched. And I suggest you prepare for a meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Meredith's office. James, you, the board members, and the trust administrators will all be present to discuss the future of Reynolds Holdings and the trust assets. That's impossible, Diana protested. The board members have prior commitments and— Cancel them, I interrupted, unless you'd prefer we schedule this discussion with the Securities and Exchange Commission instead. The implied threat hung in the air between us, its weight visibly registering in Diana's carefully controlled expression. This isn't what Harrison would have wanted, she said finally, a last attempt to leverage emotional manipulation. Actually, it's exactly what he wanted, I corrected gently. It's why he appointed me trustee with specific instructions to protect his legacy, not just from external threats, but from internal ones as well. After Diana departed, minus her spare key and with her uncashed check, I called Charlotte to update her on the situation. Mother actually tried to bribe you? She asked, incredulous. That's, well, not entirely surprising, but still shocking. They're desperate, I explained. The financial situation at Reynolds Holdings is apparently much worse than anyone realized. Charlotte was silent for a moment. I always suspected something wasn't right. James has been increasingly erratic over the past year. Bursts of extravagant spending followed by sudden budget constraints, mood swings, secretive meetings. I assumed it was just the affair with Catherine. Speaking of Catherine, she seems to have disappeared from the narrative rather abruptly, I noted. James returned for the hearing without her. Ah, well, Charlotte said with uncharacteristic hesitation. About that. Catherine apparently discovered the financial realities shortly after they left together. When she realized James wasn't actually the secure financial prospect she'd anticipated, she reconsidered the relationship. Despite everything, I found myself laughing, a genuine, unexpected release of tension. She left him when she found out he wasn't as rich as she thought? Essentially, yes. Apparently, things imploded quite spectacularly at some resort in the Cayman Islands. James had to borrow money from Mother just to get home. The cosmic justice of it was almost too perfect, the Mistress abandoning him for the same materialistic self-interest that had motivated their affair in the first place. Does he know about tomorrow's meeting? I asked. Mother called him immediately after leaving you. From what I gather, they're in full crisis management mode. The following day, I arrived at Meredith's office 30 minutes early to review our strategy one final time. The conference room had been arranged with deliberate care, documentation of the financial irregularities organized in labeled portfolios, the trust documents prominently displayed and seating strategically positioned to separate Diana and James from their natural allies on the board. Remember, Meredith advised as we waited, This isn't about punishment or revenge, even though those might be emotionally satisfying. This is about crafting a solution that serves justice while preserving what can be salvaged of Harrison's legacy. The participants arrived in quick succession. First Martin Schaefer with a junior associate, then the trust administrators, followed by the 3 board members. Diana entered alone, her expression betraying nothing of yesterday's confrontation. James arrived last, looking haggard and tense in a suit that, while expensive, hung slightly loose on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. Once everyone was seated, Meredith called the meeting to order with professional precision. Thank you all for making yourselves available on short notice. We've called this meeting to address several serious matters affecting Reynolds Holdings, the Reynolds Family Trust, and the pending divorce proceedings between Vanessa and James Reynolds. She nodded to me, ceding the floor as we had planned. Taking a deep breath, I looked directly at the board members, individuals who had known Harrison personally and had committed to upholding his vision for the company. I've asked you here today because Harrison Reynolds entrusted me with specific responsibilities regarding his legacy. Recent events have made it clear that those responsibilities now require difficult but necessary action. Without dramatic flourish but with methodical clarity, I outlined what we had discovered: the financial misrepresentations, the failing projects concealed from investors and board members, the attempted misappropriation of trust funds. As I spoke, I distributed the forensic accounting summaries, allowing each person time to review the evidence. The reactions ranged from visible shock, from the board members, to tight-lipped resignation, from James, to calculated neutrality, from Diana. Martin Schaefer began furiously taking notes, likely cataloging potential legal exposures. These allegations are serious, began Harold Winters, the senior board member and Harrison's oldest friend. If accurate, they represent profound breaches of fiduciary duty and corporate governance. They're accurate, I confirmed. We've had independent forensic accountants verify every detail. James finally spoke, his voice carrying a desperate edge. This is being blown completely out of proportion. Yes, there have been some reporting irregularities, but the projects themselves are fundamentally sound. They just need additional capital investment to overcome temporary setbacks. Temporary setbacks? Echoed Barbara Chen, another board member with significant financial expertise. The Westlake project alone shows negative projections exceeding $8 million. That's not a temporary setback. That's a catastrophic failure of both planning and execution. More importantly, added Michael Townsend, representing the trust administrators, any attempt to access trust funds based on these misrepresentations would constitute trust fraud, a criminal offense with serious implications for all involved. As the gravity of the situation registered fully with everyone present, a heavy silence settled over the room. Years of careful deception had been exposed in the span of 30 minutes, rendering the elaborate fictions James and Diana had constructed, suddenly, irreparably transparent. "What do you want?" Diana finally asked, her question directed solely at me. "Clearly you've orchestrated this revelation for a purpose." The moment had arrived, the confrontation reaching its crucial turning point. I could demand James's removal from the company, insist on crushing financial penalties in our divorce settlement, even push for criminal charges. The power to inflict maximum damage was undeniably mine in this moment. Instead, I placed a document on the table, one Meredith and I had prepared with careful consideration of all competing interests. "This is my proposal," I said, distributing copies to everyone present. "It represents what I believe would be Harrison's approach to this situation. Firm, but fair, focused on preservation rather than destruction." The proposal outlined a comprehensive restructuring. James would step down as CEO but retain a non-executive position reflecting his ownership stake. A new executive leadership team would be appointed by the board with input from the trust administrators. The failing projects would be addressed transparently with affected investors rather than concealed. And most importantly, new governance protocols would be established to prevent similar issues in the future. Regarding our divorce, I proposed a settlement that represented true equity. Recovery of my portion of the misappropriated funds plus fair division of our marital assets, but without punitive financial demands that might further destabilize the company. I remain trustee, as Harrison intended, I concluded, not to control or manipulate, but to ensure the trust assets continue to support the values and vision he established. Harold was the first to respond, his weathered face somber with a mixture of disappointment and relief. This is, unexpectedly, magnanimous, given the circumstances. It protects the company's future while addressing the serious breaches that have occurred. It's eminently reasonable, agreed Barbara. More than reasonable, frankly. All eyes turned to James and Diana, the proposal's terms clearly not what they had anticipated. James looked almost bewildered by the absence of vindictiveness, while Diana's expression remained carefully unreadable. Why? James finally asked, the single word containing genuine confusion. After what I did to you personally, emptying our accounts, the affair, leaving the way I did, why offer terms that preserve anything for me? It was the first acknowledgement he had made of the personal betrayal, the first indication that he recognized the human cost of his actions beyond their financial and legal implications. Because this isn't just about you and me, I replied honestly. It's about Harrison's legacy, about the employees whose livelihoods depend on Reynolds Holdings, about the values that should guide decisions even when they're difficult. And because destroying something is easy, building and preserving what's worthwhile is the harder, better choice. As the meeting concluded with tentative agreement to proceed with my proposal, pending legal review and formal board approval, I felt an unexpected sense of peace replacing the anger and hurt that had driven me forward since discovering James's betrayal. This confrontation hadn't been about winning or losing, about punishment or revenge. It had been about establishing truth as the foundation for whatever came next, for Reynolds Holdings, for the trust Harrison had established, and for my own life moving forward. Later that evening, as Charlotte and I shared dinner at my house, she raised her glass in a quiet toast. To Father, she said simply, he knew exactly what he was doing when he made you trustee. I'm not sure I deserve that much credit, I admitted. I was just trying to find a solution that felt right, that honored his values while addressing the very real wrongs that had occurred. That's precisely why you deserved his trust, she replied. Mother and James have always pursued what benefits them individually. You considered what would serve justice while preserving what matters. As we continued our dinner, discussing next steps and the practical realities of implementing the proposed changes, I realized something fundamental had shifted within me. The woman who had awakened to devastating betrayal just days earlier had discovered reserves of strength, wisdom, and integrity she hadn't known she possessed. Diana's dismissive assessment throughout our marriage, that I had somehow married above my station, that I should be perpetually grateful for inclusion in their world, now seemed not only cruel, but deeply misguided. Far from being unworthy of the Reynolds name, I had proven to be perhaps its most faithful steward in this moment of crisis. You know, Charlotte observed, noticing my momentary introspection, when all this started, Mother told me you'd never been good enough for James, that you'd always been beneath our family's standards. I nodded, unsurprised. She made similar remarks to me directly. Charlotte smiled wryly. The extraordinary irony is that you've proven to be the only one truly worthy of Father's legacy. James may have had the name, but you embodied the principles that made that name meaningful in the first place. As I considered her words, I recalled Diana's frequent implication throughout my marriage. You never deserved him anyway. For the first time, I found myself in complete agreement with her assessment, but not for the reasons she had intended. I never deserved a husband who could betray trust so completely, who could abandon commitment without conversation, who could violate financial partnership without remorse. What I deserved, what everyone deserves, was integrity, respect, and genuine partnership. Harrison had recognized those qualities in me even when I had sometimes doubted them in myself. Now, faced with the most significant challenge of my life, I had rediscovered my own capacity for principled action even in the face of profound personal hurt. The path forward would not be simple. Implementing the proposed changes at Reynolds Holdings would require sustained effort and vigilance. Finalizing the divorce would involve practical complications and emotional processing. Rebuilding my individual life would demand courage and patience. But I would face those challenges standing firmly in my own truth rather than shrinking to accommodate someone else's expectations. And in that recognition lay the most profound victory of all. Not over James or Diana, but over the doubts and accommodations that had gradually diminished my sense of self throughout our marriage. My husband had emptied our accounts for his mistress, forgetting who controlled his trust. But in that betrayal, I had rediscovered something far more valuable than money or position: my own unwavering commitment to integrity, and the strength to uphold it even when doing so was difficult. That, I now understood, was the true inheritance Harrison had recognized and entrusted to me, not merely legal authority over financial assets, but the moral courage to use that authority wisely and well. The following weeks unfolded with remarkable efficiency. The board formally accepted my proposed restructuring plan, appointing Charlotte as interim CEO, a decision that surprised everyone except me. Despite never holding an official executive position at Reynolds Holdings, Charlotte possessed both the business acumen and ethical grounding necessary to guide the company through this transitional period. More importantly, she understood the delicate balance between addressing past transgressions and building toward a sustainable future. The trust administrators, impressed by my handling of the crisis, not only affirmed my continued role as trustee, but expanded my advisory capacity regarding investment decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me. The position Diana had fought so desperately to remove me from had been strengthened by her own actions. The paperwork for your divorce settlement is ready for review, Meredith informed me during our weekly update meeting. James has signed everything without contest. The terms are exactly as we outlined: recovery of your portion of the misappropriated funds, equitable division of marital assets, and full retention of your professional practice and intellectual property. I reviewed the documents carefully, still finding it somewhat surreal to see 12 years of marriage reduced to clinical legal terminology and financial calculations. Something still bothers me, I admitted to Meredith. James accepted these terms with barely any negotiation. That's completely contrary to his usual approach to any agreement. Meredith nodded thoughtfully. I had the same observation. Martin indicated James was specifically insistent on avoiding any further confrontation or legal proceedings, regardless of potential financial implications. That doesn't sound like the James I know. He negotiates the price of breakfast at restaurants. People sometimes react unpredictably when their carefully constructed facades crumble, Meredith observed. Perhaps he's simply accepting the consequences of his actions. While I wanted to believe this represented genuine accountability, experience had taught me that James's motivations were rarely so straightforward. Still, the settlement offered fair resolution without unnecessary complications, which served my practical interests regardless of his underlying reasons for accepting it. After signing the divorce papers, the final legal severing of my connection to James, I expected to feel something momentous. Instead, I experienced a quiet, undramatic certainty that this chapter of my life was closing appropriately, making space for whatever might come next. That next began taking shape more quickly than anticipated. 2 days after finalizing my divorce, I received an unexpected call from Barbara Chen, the board member with significant expertise in historical preservation. Vanessa, I'll get straight to the point, she began, characteristically direct. The Harrington Foundation is seeking a preservation consultant for their adaptive reuse project in Providence. It's a series of 19th-century textile mills being converted to mixed-use sustainable development. Given your background in architectural history and preservation, I believe you would be perfect for the role. The Harrington Project was precisely the kind of work I had always been passionate about. Thoughtful reimagining of historical structures for contemporary needs while honoring their architectural and cultural significance. During my marriage, I had gradually reduced my professional commitments to accommodate James's increasingly demanding schedule and social obligations. The opportunity to engage with a major preservation project represented not just professional advancement but personal reclamation. I'd be very interested, I replied, professional training keeping my excitement appropriately modulated. Though I should note my practice is currently structured for smaller-scale consultations rather than major projects. That's precisely what I wanted to discuss, Barbara continued. This would require expanding your practice, possibly bringing on additional specialists. The Harrington Foundation has allocated substantial resources for preservation expertise. They view it as central to the project's integrity rather than a regulatory checkbox. The prospect was both exhilarating and slightly intimidating. Scaling my practice would require significant investment of time, energy, and resources during an already transformative period in my personal life. May I think about it for a few? I asked. Of course. The selection committee meets next Friday. If you're interested, I'd need your portfolio and project approach by Wednesday. After ending the call, I found myself standing in my home office, surrounded by carefully organized documentation of past preservation projects, the professional foundation I had maintained even while other aspects of my identity had been gradually compromised during my marriage. The Harrington opportunity represented a crossroads. I could continue operating my practice at its current modest scale, or I could embrace expansion into more ambitious territory. The decision felt weighted with significance beyond mere professional considerations. That evening, as I contemplated my options over dinner, the doorbell rang. Opening it revealed a surprise visitor, Catherine Lawrence, James's former assistant and brief-lived paramour, looking considerably less polished than during our previous encounters. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," she said, displaying uncharacteristic hesitation. "I wouldn't blame you if you slammed the door in my face." Curiosity overrode what might have been justified hostility. "What are you doing here, Catherine?" "I need to tell you something. Something important that you should know before everything is finalized with James." I considered her for a moment, then stepped back to allow her entry. Whatever information she possessed, hearing it directly seemed preferable to wondering about it later. In my living room, Catherine declined offered refreshments, seemingly eager to deliver her message without preamble. "James has been planning to leave the country permanently," she stated flatly. "He has established residency documentation for São Paulo, where extradition for certain financial crimes is notoriously difficult. He's been liquidating personal assets and transferring funds through multiple offshore accounts." The revelation was unexpected but not entirely shocking given recent events. "How do you know this?" "Because I helped him set it up," she admitted, having the grace to look ashamed. Before I understood what was really happening at Reynolds Holdings, he presented it as legitimate tax planning for international expansion. She pulled a flash drive from her purse and placed it on the coffee table. "This contains documentation of the accounts, the residency arrangements, and communications regarding his plans. He's scheduled to leave the country this Sunday." I studied her carefully, searching for motivation behind this disclosure. "Why are you telling me this now?" Catherine met my gaze directly for the first time. "Because I made a terrible mistake, getting involved with James, and an even worse one helping him prepare for what amounts to financial flight." I'm trying to correct at least one of those mistakes before it's too late. Does this have anything to do with James abandoning you in the Cayman Islands when you discovered he wasn't as financially secure as you thought? I asked, recalling Charlotte's information. She flinched slightly but didn't deny it. I deserved that, but this isn't about me or my poor choices. It's about preventing James from evading responsibility for what he's done. To the company, to investors, and yes, to you. After Catherine departed, I immediately called Meredith, explaining the situation and arranging for the flash drives, contents to be verified. By morning, we had confirmation. James was indeed planning to flee the jurisdiction permanently, likely anticipating that our settlement agreement would provide temporary cover until he could establish himself beyond. Legal reach. This changes our approach significantly, Meredith observed during our emergency meeting the following day. We need to involve the trust administrators and the board immediately. There may be grounds for criminal charges given the apparent intent to evade financial responsibility. The next 48 hours passed in a flurry of activity. Meredith coordinated with financial authorities to freeze James's personal accounts based on the evidence Catherine had provided. The board called an emergency session to address this new development and its implications for the company restructuring. The trust administrators implemented additional protections for the trust assets. By Saturday evening, 24 hours before James's planned departure, the legal net had closed completely. He was detained while attempting to access a private airfield with luggage containing over $400,000 in various currencies and bearer bonds. The news reached me via Charlotte, who called from the Reynolds Holdings offices where she had been working, late on transition planning. "They've arrested him," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "The Financial Crimes Unit took him into custody about an hour ago. Mother is beside herself. She's already called 3 different attorneys. How are you doing with all this?" I asked, genuinely concerned for her well-being. Despite everything, James was still her brother. "Honestly, I'm relieved," she admitted. "Not about James facing criminal charges. That's painful regardless of how justified it might be. I'm relieved that we can finally stop pretending. The constant maintenance of appearances, the covering for his increasingly erratic decisions, the willful blindness about where things were heading. It was exhausting." Her words resonated deeply. The exhaustion of maintaining false narratives, whether about a troubled company or a troubled marriage, exacted its own cost separate from the concrete problems being concealed. "What happens now?" I asked. "From a company perspective, we continue with the restructuring plan you proposed. It's actually easier now that there's no ambiguity about James's position." She paused briefly. "From a family perspective, I don't know. Mother is still operating from the Reynolds playbook, protect the name above all else. I'm trying to establish a different approach." After ending the call, I sat in my garden, watching twilight settle over carefully tended plants that had somehow survived the recent turmoil through their own quiet resilience. The parallels to my personal journey were not lost on me. James's attempted flight represented the final severing of any lingering emotional connection I might have maintained. The man I had married or thought I had married simply didn't exist. The person who had emptied our accounts, who had betrayed our partnership, who had attempted to flee rather than face consequences, that was the real James Reynolds, finally revealed without pretense or facade. The understanding brought neither satisfaction nor additional pain, just a clean, clarifying certainty that allowed me to focus fully on the future rather than the past. Monday morning found me in my office, surrounded by architectural drawings, historical photographs, and material samples as I prepared my proposal for the Harrington Foundation project. The work absorbed me completely, the challenge of honoring historical integrity while enabling contemporary functionality perfectly aligned with my professional passion. Midway through the morning, Diana Reynolds called. I briefly considered letting it go to voicemail, then decided direct communication was preferable to avoidance. "Vanessa," she began, her voice lacking its usual imperious confidence. "I'm calling regarding James's situation." "I'm not involved in the criminal proceedings, Diana. That's between James and the authorities." "I understand that," she acknowledged. "I'm actually calling because I owe you an apology." The statement was so unexpected that I momentarily wondered if I had misheard. "For 12 years, I treated you as if you were somehow beneath our family's standing," she continued. "When I didn't immediately respond, I questioned your suitability, your background, your understanding of our world. I was wrong." "What brought this on?" I asked, genuinely curious about this unprecedented display of humility. "Harrison knew exactly what he was doing when he made you trustee instead of me or James," she said, a note of reluctant admiration entering her voice. "He saw what I refused to see. That character matters more than pedigree. That integrity isn't inherited with a family name." I remained silent, allowing her the space to continue this unexpected reflection. "The way you've handled this entire situation, from James's betrayal to the company's financial issues, has been exemplary. You could have destroyed everything in justified anger. Instead, you found a path that addressed the wrongs while preserving what was worth saving." "I was just trying to honor Harrison's trust in me," I replied simply. "Yes, well, he clearly saw something in you that I chose to ignore." She paused briefly. "I want you to know that I've instructed our family attorney to cease all attempts to challenge your trustee position. It belongs with you, as Harrison intended." After concluding the conversation with appropriate civility, I returned to my work on the Harrington proposal with renewed focus. Diana's acknowledgement, while gratifying, in its way, felt like closure on a chapter rather than validation I still needed. By Wednesday, my proposal for the Harrington Foundation was complete. A comprehensive vision for preserving the industrial heritage of the textile mills, while reimagining their purpose for contemporary community needs. The work represented my best professional thinking, unconstrained by concerns about fitting into particular expectations or moderating my expertise to accommodate others' comfort. After submitting the proposal, I took the afternoon off, a small act of self-care that would have been unthinkable during my marriage, when any unscheduled time was quickly filled with Reynolds' family obligations or James's professional networking needs. I drove to a small nature preserve at the edge of the city, a place I had discovered during the early years of my architectural history studies, but had rarely visited since my marriage. The autumn afternoon was perfect for hiking. Crisp air, brilliant foliage, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy of trees. As I followed the trail upward toward a ridge overlooking the valley, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past months. The devastating betrayal that had initiated this transformation now seemed like a necessary catalyst, rather than merely a painful ending. Had James not emptied our accounts, had he chosen a more conventional path to ending our marriage, I might never have discovered the strength, clarity, and purpose that had emerged from navigating this crisis. I might have continued accommodating, compromising core aspects of myself to maintain a relationship that ultimately diminished, rather than enhanced my authentic being. At the ridge's summit, I paused to absorb the panoramic view: rolling hills, the distant city skyline, the river winding through the landscape like a silver thread connecting disparate elements. The perspective seemed an apt metaphor for my current vantage point, seeing patterns and connections that had been impossible to discern while immersed in the day-to-day navigation of a compromised marriage. My phone chimed with an incoming email, Barbara Chen informing me that the Harrington Foundation had received my proposal and scheduled an interview for the following week. The professional opportunity represented not just a chance to apply my expertise to a significant preservation project, but a symbolic step into a future defined by my own vision rather than someone else's expectations. As I descended the trail, With lengthening shadows marking the day's progression toward evening, I found myself profoundly grateful for this unexpected journey. James had emptied our accounts for his mistress, forgetting who controlled his trust. That single act of betrayal had initiated a cascade of revelations and choices that ultimately freed me from constraints I had barely recognized until they were removed. Diana's dismissive assessment throughout our marriage echoed in my mind. "You never deserved him anyway." She had been right all along, though not in the way she had intended. I never deserved a relationship that required diminishment of my authentic self. I never deserved a partner who could violate trust so completely. I never deserved to have my worth constantly measured against arbitrary standards of family position or social conformity. What I deserved, what everyone deserves, was the opportunity to stand firmly in their truth, to contribute their unique gifts without apology or compromise, to build connections based on mutual respect rather than power. Imbalance. The betrayal that had seemed like the ending of everything important had actually been the beginning of something far more valuable, a life realigned with my deepest values, unconstrained by others' limited vision of who I should be or what I could accomplish. Reaching my car as dusk settled over the preserve, I felt a profound sense of alignment with myself, with my path forward, with the understanding that had gradually crystallized through this challenging journey. The most significant trust isn't financial or legal, but the trust we place in our own capacity to rise from betrayal into authentic strength. James had forgotten who controlled his trust fund. In doing so, he had inadvertently reminded me who controlled something far more valuable: my own destiny. The Harrington Foundation's offices occupied the top floor of a beautifully restored Georgian building in downtown Providence. As I stepped off the elevator for my interview, I was immediately struck by how thoughtfully the space balanced preservation with functionality, original moldings and hardwood floors, coexisting harmoniously with modern lighting and ergonomic workstations. "Ms. Reynolds, I'm Elliot Harrington." A man in his early 60s approached with an extended hand. "Thank you for making the trip to Providence." "It's Vanessa Chen again, actually," I corrected gently, having recently reclaimed my maiden name. "And the architecture alone made the trip worthwhile." Elliot's smile deepened. "A preservationist who notices details. Already a promising sign. Please come through to the conference room. The selection committee is eager to discuss your proposal." The committee comprised 5 members, each representing different facets of the ambitious textile mill project: historical preservation, sustainable development, community integration, financial oversight, and arts programming. For the next 90 minutes, I outlined my vision for honoring the industrial heritage of the structures while reimagining their functionality for contemporary community needs. "What particularly impressed us about your proposal," noted Dr. Amelia Jordan, the preservation specialist, "was how you approached the tension between historical authenticity and modern sustainability requirements. Most consultants favor one at the expense of the other." "I believe that tension is actually creative opportunity," I replied. "The most successful adaptive reuse projects don't view preservation and innovation as competing values, but as complementary forces that enhance each other when properly balanced." As the interview continued, I found myself speaking with a confidence and clarity that felt both natural and somewhat surprising. Throughout my marriage, I had consciously modulated my professional voice, careful not to appear too assertive, too passionate, or too knowledgeable in ways that might conflict with James's need to be perceived as the dominant partner in our relationship. Now, freed from those constraints, my expertise flowed without internal censorship or apology. I wasn't performing competence, I was simply embodying it. "There's one aspect of your background we'd like to explore further," said Elliot as the formal portion of the interview concluded. "Your role as trustee of the Reynolds Family Trust represents significant fiduciary experience. How might that inform your approach to balancing preservation values with financial realities?" The question touched directly on my recent experiences, though I doubted the committee knew the specific circumstances beyond what might have appeared in business publications about Reynolds Holdings restructuring. Serving as trustee has reinforced my understanding that financial stewardship isn't just about protecting assets, I explained carefully. It's about ensuring those assets serve their intended purpose with integrity. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions that prioritize long-term value over short-term convenience. Elliot nodded thoughtfully. That perspective aligns well with our foundation's approach. We're not merely funding a development project, we're investing in the ongoing vitality of Providence's industrial heritage in ways that serve the community for generations. By the time I departed, the formal interview had evolved into a collaborative conversation about possibilities, challenges, and shared vision. The committee members had engaged with my ideas substantively rather than performatively, creating genuine dialogue rather than evaluative scrutiny. As Elliot walked me to the elevator, he offered an unexpected observation. We reviewed 17 proposals for this position. Yours wasn't the most elaborate or technically detailed, but it was unquestionably the most authentic. Authentic? Many preservation consultants write what they think clients want to hear, prioritizing fashionable sustainability terminology or promising unrealistic historical purity. Your proposal acknowledged real tensions and presented thoughtful navigation rather than easy answers. He smiled. That kind of intellectual honesty is surprisingly rare, especially in initial proposals. His words resonated deeply as I drove back to Connecticut that afternoon. Authenticity had become increasingly central to my personal reconstruction, following James's betrayal, not just in professional contexts, but in every aspect of life. The careful accommodations and strategic self-editing that had characterized my marriage now seemed like a form of betrayal against myself, more insidious for being self-imposed rather than externally demanded. When I arrived home, I found a package waiting on my doorstep. The return address indicated it was from Harrison Reynolds' former personal attorney, Edward Gladwell, who had retired to Arizona several years earlier. Intrigued, I opened it to find a leather-bound journal and an accompanying letter. Dear Vanessa, news of recent events at Reynolds Holdings has reached me even in my desert retirement. While I'm saddened by the circumstances, I am not entirely surprised. Harrison had concerns about James's character long before his illness, concerns he shared with me as both his attorney and friend. After Harrison's passing, I was instructed to hold this journal until certain conditions were met. Those conditions now having been satisfied, I am forwarding it to you as he requested. The journal contains Harrison's private thoughts regarding the future of Reynolds Holdings and his hopes for the trust he established. I believe you'll find it provides valuable context for decisions you've already made and may yet need to make. As trustee, Harrison saw in you qualities that he found lacking in his own son. His decision to appoint you trustee was neither impulsive nor sentimental, but a carefully considered choice based on his assessment of character and judgment. Should you wish to discuss the journal's contents, I remain available despite my retirement. With respect and admiration, Edward Gladwell. With reverent hands, I opened the journal to find Harrison's distinctive handwriting filling its pages, observations about business ethics, reflections on legacy, and increasingly toward the end, concerns about James's approach to both personal and professional responsibilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.